What if I told you that one of the most mind-blowing financial scams in history didn't happen on Wall Street, wasn't pulled off by some polished CEO, and didn't even involve a single spreadsheet? No, it started with a boy selling kerosene on the dusty streets of Ghana. This is the true story of how that same boy, armed with nothing but ambition, lies, and a deadly charming smile, nearly convinced the world that he alone had access to a $27 billion fortune. Not million, billion with a B. Diplomats believed him. Bankers gave him checks. Ordinary people handed him their life savings. And by the time anyone figured it out, he was already gone. They called him the custodian of a secret trust fund. We call him one of the most dangerous fraudsters the world has ever seen. But let's rewind. Before the women, the champagne, the bodyguards, the fake embassies, the international headlines, before the scam grew legs and sprinted across continents, there was just a boy named John Kofi Agyekong, born in 1941 in the heart of Ghana. Or, that's an understatement. He wasn't just struggling, he was hungry. And in hunger, John found fuel. They called him Kerosene Boy because he hawked kerosene in glass bottles in the streets to pay his school fees. But that nickname didn't humiliate him, it planted a seed. John didn't just want to rise out of poverty, he wanted to annihilate every trace of it, not just for himself, but in the eyes of anyone who dared to remember where he came from. That obsession drove him to America, and that's where things got dangerous. He told people he was following in the footsteps of Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah. He said he was attending the University of Pennsylvania, but the truth? He was waiting tables at the Union League Club in Philadelphia, cleaning up after the real elite. Until one day he wasn't. 1 year later, John stopped being Kerosene Boy. He became a new man, entirely literally. He assumed the identity of his former roommate. Just like that, he began a new life as a fake student, blending seamlessly into the African academic circles in Philly. They believed him. He was smooth, confident, always well-dressed, always saying the right thing at the right time. And why wouldn't they believe him? This man could tell you the sun was blue, and you'd squint up at the sky just to check. But scams like these don't just end in dorm rooms and potlucks. They evolve. John returned to Ghana in 1963 with more than just a fake degree. He came with a story that would make him powerful or get him killed. He claimed someone was trying to assassinate President Nkrumah. The government didn't take that lightly. He was arrested and thrown into jail, but his luck, unbelievable. In 1966, a coup overthrew Nkrumah, and John walked free. Now here's where most con men might slow down. Take the brush with prison as a wake-up call, but John wasn't most con men. He was just getting started. By the 1970s, his lies were bigger, slicker, and far more dangerous. He claimed to be a medical doctor, then a diplomat, then a senior official at the African Development Bank. He layered personas like armor, each more respectable than the last. He was no longer hustling scraps, he was playing with nations. One day, tired of the local game, John set his sights back on the U.S. This time, he didn't come as a humble immigrant. He showed up in Philadelphia, dressed in tailored suits, posing as a diplomat on a special mission to the United Nations. He checked into the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, lived lavishly, ran up a $2,700 bill, and then vanished. Well, almost. The hotel staff eventually realized he wasn't who he claimed to be. They called the Ghanaian mission for confirmation. That's when the real diplomats denied any knowledge of him. The lie unraveled. John was arrested again. But even behind bars, he wasn't done scheming. He didn't mope in his cell. He didn't weep. No, he studied. He networked. He sharpened his game. In prison, he observed how real influence worked. He copied the habits of high-profile inmates, built relationships, and waited for his next opportunity. And then it came. A door opened, and in walked the man who would unknowingly give John the final piece of the puzzle, General Ignatius Q2 Achimwang, Ghana's military dictator at the time. How did a fraudster land a private audience with a military general while in jail? That's the kind of mystery that makes this story feel like fiction. John sat across from the general and told him a wild tale, that he had once been very close to the late President Nkrumah, that Nkrumah had entrusted him with a massive gold reserve hidden away in Swiss banks, worth an eye-watering $27 billion. According to John, only he had the power to retrieve it. The general's eyes widened. Ghana's economy was collapsing. This could be salvation. Of course, it was a lie. There was no gold, no trust, no secret fortune. But John's storytelling was so rich, so confident, so impossible to ignore, that the general gave him something far more powerful than money. He gave him freedom. John was released. Not only that, he was handed a diplomatic passport and official backing to travel the world in search of this mythical fortune. He named the mission the Oman Ghana Trust Fund. And just like that, the scam was reborn. But this time, it was global. He set up a fake import-export company, created a mock government agency, wrote letters with forged seals and documents so authentic-looking they fooled lawyers, executives, even former U.S. government officials. Investors poured in from everywhere: America, Britain, South Korea. Some were wealthy businessmen. Others were college students. A few were elderly widows looking for a miracle. They didn't know they were funding a fantasy. They thought they were buying access to generational wealth. John promised them 10x, even 20x returns. He said the only reason the gold couldn't be retrieved yet was due to legal complications and banking delays. But if they could just help cover the legal fees, the rewards would flow. So they paid, and paid, and paid. He raked in over $200 million before anyone caught on. His lifestyle, outrageous. Luxury hotels, personal chefs flown in from Ghana, bodyguards, private suites, chauffeured cars, women, champagne, and still the charm. Still the soft-spoken confidence that made even the most skeptical investor feel seen and special. He would meet his investors in posh hotels, his assistant ushering them through grand doors into ornate lounges. They'd sit in suits, clutching documents, waiting eagerly for the big news. But instead of payouts, they got delays, and more excuses, and more requests for cash. Still they stayed. Still they believed. By now, some of them had been waiting for years. They were emotionally invested, financially trapped, and psychologically anchored to the dream. The idea of walking away felt worse than continuing to hope, and John knew that. He fed off their desperation. He manipulated their fear of missing out. He made them feel like insiders on a global secret, and still ... no one got a dime. But here's where things get truly explosive when the walls start closing in. when governments get involved and when the unstoppable finally meets the inevitable. You're not ready for what's coming next. The rain fell hard that morning in Gurney. Wind howled along the west coast, slamming into the windows of the Grand May Hotel. But inside the luxury suite, tension was thicker than the fog outside. They'd come from everywhere, New Jersey, London, Seoul, arriving with suitcases in hand, hope on their faces and desperation in their eyes, investors, believers, victims, all of them waiting to meet one man, John Blay. They were told that this meeting would finally be it, that the long-promised billions in the Oman Ghana Trust Fund were about to be released, that years of sacrifice, of waiting, of pouring money into legal fees and travel costs, would pay off. But those who had been here before knew better. Excitement had dried into quiet suspicion. This wasn't the first time Blay had gathered them together like this, and each time the end of the rainbow slipped a little further away. Inside the room, Blay wore his usual quiet sophistication. A red patterned shirt, slacks, polished shoes, and that ever so relaxed aura of someone who knew he was the smartest man in the room. His secretary, Mary Lou Valeno, handled the logistics. She ushered each guest through the grand white doors and onto plush sofas. They waited. There was Walter Haddock, a businessman from New Jersey. Ian Reed, a British investor with a construction empire. Kim Jong-un, translating for the Korean contingent. Even an officer assigned by the Ghanaian government sat among them, sipping milky tea in silence. No one spoke about how long they'd been waiting. No one questioned why, yet again, the payout was delayed. When Blay finally spoke, his tone was measured, his words as smooth as silk. He told them again that the funds were still inaccessible, that a few more hurdles remained. But victory was near, very near, and again they nodded. Not because they believed, but because it was easier than admitting they'd been fooled. Later that evening, Blay vanished, packed his bags, slipped out, flew to London, and like sheep, the investors followed. Why? Because some con men steal with force, but the greatest, they steal with belief. And Blay had mastered the art of making people believe in something invisible. But not everyone stayed silent. Behind the scenes, the walls were beginning to crack. Barry Ginsberg, a Philadelphia attorney and longtime investor in the Oman Ghana Trust Fund, had finally had enough. After years of sunk costs and circular excuses, he did what no one else dared to do. He went to the authorities. He brought documents, correspondence, financial records, everything he had. And when prosecutors took a closer look, what they saw was staggering. A network of lies so vast it spanned 3 continents. A fake agency that looked more official than some real ones. Hundreds of victims, millions of dollars, all orbiting one man. It was no longer a scam. It was a full-blown international operation. The assistant district attorney in Philly opened a file, then another, then dozens more. And that's when the name Robert Ellis came up, a key associate of Blay's in America. Ellis had been helping him recruit investors, funnel money, and maintain appearances. But Ellis wasn't the mastermind. He was just a loyal middleman to a man whose lies were deeper than most people's truths. When Ellis stood in front of Judge Lynn Abraham for the first time, the courtroom was electric. Abraham wasn't just any judge. She was sharp, fearless, a student of African history who saw through smoke and mirrors better than most. And Blay, she knew he wasn't just a trickster. He was historic, Prosecutors estimated that Blay and his associates had conned at least 300 people in Philadelphia alone, those willing to come forward. But globally, the losses were astronomical. Some said $15 million. Others swore it was over $100 million. And yet, unbelievably many victims still believed in him. Even as Ellis was arrested, even as Blay's name hit the newspapers, even as subpoenas rolled in, they believed. Because that's what true manipulation looks like. It doesn't just take your money, it takes your mind. Still, the real prize Blay himself was nowhere to be found. He had vanished again, like smoke slipping through fingers. Some said he was in London. Others spotted him in Accra. There were whispers of new investors, new fake offices, new promises. He was on the run, yes, but somehow ... still running the game. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, the unraveling continued. Ellis eventually pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison, but he wasn't the headline. Everyone wanted Blay, so the FBI issued a warrant. International alerts were triggered, airports flagged, Interpol notified, but he stayed one step ahead, always, until 1992. That's when word spread that Blay had died in Accra under house arrest. Died, but no one believed it. After all, this was the man who once faked a heart attack to escape custody. The same man who convinced seasoned generals, Ivy League lawyers, and financial institutions that $27 billion was waiting to be released from a Swiss vault. This was a man who could disappear in a crowded room. How could he be dead? The Ghanaian government insisted. They claimed he'd passed, but suspicions lingered so much so that the FBI demanded fingerprints from his corpse. Only after forensic confirmation did they finally close the file. But for many, even that wasn't enough. To this day, some of his followers still believe the money is real. They believe the trust fund exists. That one day the right bank will unlock the vault, that their payout will arrive. Delusion? Maybe. Or maybe it's the true genius of John Blay that long after he was gone, the scam lived on. Because the money wasn't just in Swiss banks. It was in their minds, in their belief, in the idea that something too good to be true could somehow ... still be true. And that's where his power truly lay. But as the trail of destruction came into focus, the damage was clearer than ever. Families ruined, marriages broken, elderly investors living on borrowed time and borrowed hope. Businesses collapsed, dreams vanished, and still people whispered his name with awe. Some even called him a financial genius. Not because of what he built, but because of what he made people believe. Even nightclub owners, even former U.S. Attorney General J.N. Mitchell, tarnished by Watergate, got swept into the gravity of Blay's scam. That's how far the deception reached. He blurred the line between lie and legacy, between ambition and madness. And that's the tragedy of it all. Because in another world, with his brilliance, his charisma, his ambition, John Blay might have been a president, a CEO, a revolutionary. Instead, ... he became a myth, a cautionary tale that walks the razor's edge between genius and criminality. But his story isn't over, because the biggest question still remains. Was he really dead? Or had he pulled the greatest con of all, faking his own death to escape one final time? Now let's unravel his global empire, the investigators who chased him across continents, and the stunning truths that were buried in the ashes of his illusion, because every great scam has an end. But not every scammer goes down. By 1992, the con was supposedly over. The trust fund had evaporated into myth. The investors were scattered, some ruined, some still hoping, and John Blay was dead. Or so they said. But here's the thing. When a man's entire legacy is built on illusion, how can anyone trust his ending? The Ghanaian authorities claimed he died under house arrest. They claimed it was natural. No press release, no grand trial. Just died. Gone. Vanished. Quietly. Too quietly. For a man who stirred up storms across continents, who mocked institutions and walked free from every trap, his death felt staged like the final act of a magician who disappears into the applause and never reappears. Some say the body didn't match, that the face was swollen, that the room where he died had no records, no trace of his identity. And remember, this is a man who once escaped prison through a hole beneath a latrine, who faked illness, who lived in other people's names like second skins. So what did the FBI do? They demanded fingerprints. They got them, and the prints ... matched. Case closed. But not for everyone, because long after that fingerprint confirmation, strange things kept happening. Years later, several Ghanaian businessmen received anonymous letters typed, stamped, postmarked from obscure towns in South America. Each letter contained apologies, instructions, and most chillingly, bank account numbers, accounts in Switzerland, in Panama, in the Cayman Islands, all in the name of shell companies that had once been linked to Omangana Trust Fund. The names? Slightly altered, but not enough to go unnoticed. John Blay, it seemed, was still moving money, even from the grave. Or through it? Investigators tried to trace the accounts. Most were empty. A few had balances, but the trail stopped cold. No withdrawals. No activity, just ghosts. Meanwhile, some of the old investors, those still breathing, began comparing notes. Stories that had never quite lined up now began to twist into eerie harmony. Too many coincidences, too many mysterious disappearances. One investor, a man named Frederick Ryman, confessed to a journalist that in 1995, 3 years after Blay's death, he'd received a phone call. The voice on the other end? Calm, familiar. It simply said the gold was never in Switzerland. Then it hung up. The number? Untraceable. But that voice? Frederick swore on his wife's grave it was him. Still, none of this was enough to reopen the case. Not officially. The legal system doesn't chase shadows. It needs evidence. And John Blay had buried every trail with surgical precision. But let's rewind. Because before he died, Blay made one last devastating play. It wasn't just about swindling the rich anymore. He was trying to rig the system at its very core. Just months before vanishing, he attempted to pull off his most brazen move, yet defrauding Gerard Bank using counterfeit travelers, checks totaling $50,000. The plan was simple. Use forged signatures from a former assistant branch manager, cash them overseas, and vanish before anyone noticed. But someone did notice. Deutsche Bank picked up on the scam. They linked it back to Philadelphia. And just like that, law enforcement closed in. Blay disappeared again. But this time they caught the associate, the assistant branch manager. And like always, it wasn't Blay who paid the price. Someone else did the time. Someone else's life crumbled while Blay melted back into the fog of his legend. Back in Philly, Robert Ellis, the trusted sidekick, was also cracking. Arrested, tried, sentenced. In court, Ellis claimed he was just a believer, that he thought it was all real, that John had even conned him. But the judge didn't buy it. Judge Lynn Abraham looked him in the eye and said what the whole city was whispering. This is one of the most intricate and insidious frauds I've ever seen. And somehow the architect of it all still walks free. She wasn't wrong. Even as Ellis sat in a cell, even as the government tried to stitch together the pieces, people across the globe still whispered about the trust fund, still whispered about John Blay, still wondered, was the money real? Could someone really fake something so big and keep it alive for that long? But here's the twist. It turns out parts of it may have been real. Not the $27 billion, of course. That was fantasy. But the accounts, the gold certificates, the forged seals, Blay didn't create them from scratch. He stole them from actual historical documents. Investigators discovered that he had managed to acquire several outdated financial documents from post-colonial Ghana ledgers, import-export certificates, even legitimate diplomatic stamps. He used these to create the illusion of a government fund that never existed, but was just real enough to fool experts. He didn't invent the lie. He built it from fragments of the truth, and that's what made it deadly, because every lie had a little truth buried in it, and no one could tell where the truth ended and the fantasy began. One banker later admitted he had the papers, he had the codes, he even had a clearance letter from the Ghanaian Ministry of Finance. I saw it, I held it in my hands. How could I doubt him? But that's the thing about the perfect con. It doesn't trick your eyes, it tricks your heart. And in the end, that's what John Blay stole most of all. Not just millions of dollars, not just hope. He stole people's belief in what was possible, their sense of trust, their ability to separate dream from delusion. He became legend, and maybe that was the goal all along. Not money, not power, but immortality. Because whether John Blay died in 1992 or simply disappeared forever, one thing is certain: no one ever saw the money, no one ever saw the vault, and no one ever saw him again. But the story, it's still here, still alive, still whispering in the shadows of finance and fraud, still warning anyone with ears to listen, that sometimes the greatest danger isn't the scam you see coming, it's the one you desperately want to believe. And if you've made it this far, you just got played too.